Welcome back to Evie's Mafia Romance. Here is your next story.
You look like you need help.
Perhaps. What makes you think that?
Your
The
clothes.
buzz of Seoul's neon lights usually drowns out the loneliness, but tonight it amplified the emptiness in my chest. With my family's relentless texts about finding the one piling up, I scanned the crowded sidewalk for an escape and locked eyes with a ragged figure huddled against a wall. Little did I know, hiring him as my fake Valentine would unravel secrets darker than the alley shadows. My phone vibrated against my palm like a persistent insect. I glanced down at the screen, the blue light reflecting in the cold humidity of a Seoul winter. Tuilika, your cousin just got engaged. Why are you still alone in that cold city? Your AI won't keep you warm at night, my mother's latest message read. I sighed, the puff of white air vanishing into the smell of spicy tteokbokki and diesel fumes. Tomorrow was the Valentine's Day Investor Gala, the most important night for my startup, and I knew the vultures would be circling. Not just for my software, but for my dignity. They wanted to see the ambitious expat fail, or worse, see her come crawling back to someone like Tafari. That's when I saw him. He sat in the shadow of a luxury department store, a stark contrast to the gleaming glass. His face was obscured by a grime-streaked hoodie, and a rough beard hid his jawline, but there was something wrong with the way he held himself. Most beggars slumped. They tried to occupy as little space as possible. This man sat with his back against the brick as if it were a throne, his legs crossed at the ankles with a casual, terrifying grace. I stopped in front of him, my heels clicking on the pavement. I didn't offer change. Instead, I tucked my phone into my leather coat and leaned in. You look like you need a hot meal and a reason to stay out of the wind. I need a man who can stay quiet, wear a suit, and look like he'd kill anyone who interrupts my dinner. Are you available for hire? Or do you have a prior engagement with that cardboard box? He didn't move for a long beat. Then, he tilted his head back. Beneath the layers of dirt and the shadow of his hood, a pair of eyes caught the neon glow of a nearby sign. Sharp, piercing, and entirely too intelligent. A slow, rhythmic thrum started in my veins. A fake date? His voice was a low rasp, like gravel over velvet. It wasn't the voice of a man who had spent years begging. It was the voice of a man who chose his words with surgical precision. That's a dangerous game for a woman with so much to lose, Tuilika Theron. My heart skipped. How do you know my name? Your face is on the side of that bus. He flicked a finger toward a passing advertisement for my AI security firm. The digital shield of Seoul. You're looking for a shield in the physical world tonight. My price isn't cheap. I smirked, regaining my footing. I'm an entrepreneur. I don't pay sticker price. One night, $500. A shower, a tailored suit you'll return tomorrow, and the finest steak you've ever tasted. In exchange, you don't speak unless I nod, and you look at me like I'm the only person in the room. Deal? The man stood up. He was taller than I expected, his presence expanding until he seemed to dwarf the skyscrapers around us. He reached out a hand, calloused and steady, and shook mine. Deal. Call me Ho-chul. We made a quick stop at a 24-hour boutique in Gangnam. I watched from the lounge as the staff, whisked into efficiency by my credit card, transformed him. When he emerged, the transformation was jarring. We had kept the beard, trimmed to a rugged stubble, and his long hair was slicked back into a sharp, modern knot. The charcoal suit hugged shoulders that were far too broad for a man supposedly starving on the streets. He smelled of sandalwood and expensive soap now, the scent of the city replaced by something primal and sophisticated. The gala at the Lotte Signiel was a sea of champagne and predatory smiles. As we entered, Ho-chul placed a hand on the small of my back. His touch was searing even through the fabric of my silk dress. I felt his eyes scanning the room, not with awe, but with the cold calculation of a predator marking his territory. Stay focused, I whispered, adjusting my earrings. The investors are at table 4. We just need to make it through the Tuilika. The voice was like a stain on a white sheet. I stiffened as Tafari stepped out from the crowd. He looked exactly the same, expensive watch, cheap soul. His eyes were bloodshot, his suit slightly rumpled. He ignored Ho-chul entirely, stepping into my personal space with the familiar, suffocating entitlement that had defined our final months together. You really thought you could just block me? Tafari sneered, his voice rising enough to draw eyes. After everything I did for you? You're in over your head, Tui. This company, this city. You're a little girl playing with fire. You need to come home. I'm the only one who actually knows who you are. He reached for my arm, his fingers clawing. Before he could touch me, Ho-chul moved. It wasn't a violent movement, just a subtle shift in physics that put his massive frame between us. Tafari stumbled back, blinking at the beggar in the designer suit. Who the hell is this? Tafari spat. I stepped around Ho-chul, my voice cool and sharp as a diamond blade. This is my partner Tafari. Something you never were. And since you're so concerned about my fire, let's talk about yours. I checked the public ledger this morning. Your consulting firm is 3 months behind on its lease, and your gambling debts to the offshore accounts in Macau have reached 6 figures. You didn't come here for me. You came here because you're hoping I'll sign over a bridge loan to save your neck from the people you owe. The color drained from Tafari's face. You don't know what you're talking about. I wrote the algorithm that tracks high-risk financial anomalies, remember? I leaned in, my smile predatory. I didn't just block your number, Tafari. I blacklisted your credit across every major bank in this district. Now leave before I have the security team, who use my software by the way, escort you out for trespassing on a private event. Tafari opened his mouth to shout, but Ho-chul took a single step forward. He didn't say a word. He just looked down at Tafari with a cold, dead stare that made the air in the room feel 20 degrees colder. Tafari shivered, turned on his heel, and fled into the night. Welcome back, my bold shadows and midnight schemers. Before we plunge deeper into this tangled web of deception and desire, smash that subscribe button, drop a like, and share in the comments. From which corner of the world are you tuning in to this shadowy Valentine's tale? And what's the hour on your clock as you unravel these secrets with me? I adore hearing how our dark romance crew spans the globe, syncing our heartbeats across time zones in tales of hidden kings and clever queens. Your support fuels these stories of fake dates, turning fatally real. Cozy up, turn down the lights, and let's uncover what happens when a beggar becomes a boss. The adrenaline was still humming in my ears as the crowd returned to their hushed conversations. I picked up a glass of champagne from a passing tray, my hand trembling only slightly. You're efficient, Ho-chul remarked, his eyes never leaving the crowd. But you missed something. What? I asked, raising the glass to my lips. His hand shot out, gripping my wrist before the crystal touched my mouth. He leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear, making the fine hairs on my neck stand up. The waiter who handed you that tray, he wasn't wearing a name tag, and his shoes were rubber-soled tactical boots, not dress shoes. He took the glass from my hand and poured a tiny drop onto the white tablecloth. Within seconds, the liquid fizzed subtly, turning a faint, sickly yellow. My stomach dropped. Poison. Wait, I whispered, my brain racing. If someone was trying to kill me here, in the middle of a gala. The Viper. A shadow is moving toward the kitchen exit, Ho-chul muttered. If you're as smart as you say you are, you'll help me navigate the service corridor. Use that security override you're so proud of. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my clutch, pulled up my phone's admin interface, and tapped a sequence. The service elevator is 10 meters behind us. I just looped the internal cameras for 30 seconds. Move. We slipped through the heavy gold doors just as a man in a dark jacket turned the corner, his hand reaching into his coat. We spiraled through the back hallways, my heart drumming against my ribs. I used the building's schematics on my phone to guide us, unlocking magnetic seals with a swipe of my thumb, while Ho-chul moved with a terrifying silent fluidity, checking corners and guiding me with a firm hand on my waist. We burst out into the crisp night air of the back alley, the heavy steel door locking behind us. I leaned against the brick, gasping for air, the cold wind biting at my bare shoulders. I looked at the man I had hired for $500, this beggar who had just spotted a professional hit and navigated a high-security building like he owned the blueprints. I straightened my dress, trying to regain my composure. "You're more than a beggar, Ho-chul." He stepped closer, the moonlight catching the hard planes of his face, the disguise of the ragged man fully slipping to reveal the king beneath. He reached out, his thumb grazing my jawline with a possessive, lingering touch. "You handled that like a queen. But the real test is just beginning." The adrenaline was a cold, jagged thing in my veins, clashing with the humid heat of my own breath as we ducked away from the latte signal. We didn't run, running drew eyes. Instead, we moved with a synchronized, predatory rhythm through the narrow, rain-slicked arteries of Songpa-gu. The sky had finally broken, a sudden Seoul downpour blurring the neon signs into watercolor smears of violet and electric blue. "In here," Ho-chul muttered, his hand a steadying weight on the small of my back as he guided me into a basement-level cafe. The bell chimed, a lonely melodic tinkle, as we descended into a sanctuary of warmth. The air inside was thick with the comforting, savory steam of simmering broth and roasted sesame oil, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang of the rain and the ozone of the Gala. A low, melancholic K-indie track hummed from hidden speakers, the acoustic guitar strings vibrating in sync with my fading tremors. We took a corner booth, the wood worn smooth by decades of late-night diners. I watched him as he pulled out my chair, a gesture too practiced, too effortless for a man who claimed to live on the margins. He didn't wait for a menu. He simply signaled the ajumma behind the counter with a subtle nod and 2 fingers raised. "You're shaking," he said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating through the table's surface. "I'm calculating," I corrected, though my fingers were indeed fumbling as I pulled my phone from my clutch. I laid it flat on the scarred wood, the screen glowing against the dim amber light of the cafe. "Someone tried to kill me, Ho-chul, in a room full of the most powerful tech investors in Asia. That wasn't just a random mugging in the alley. That was targeted." I began scrolling through the security logs of my app, my thumbs flying over the glass. I needed to see if the breach had come from the inside, if my code had been used to track my location. The ajumma arrived, setting down 2 steaming bowls of ramyeon and a plate of kimbap that looked like art. Ho-chul picked up his chopsticks, his grip elegant, almost scholarly. He didn't dig in immediately. Instead, he leaned over, his shoulder nearly brushing mine, his scent, that intoxicating mix of sandalwood and cold rain, clouding my focus. "You're looking at the wrong layer," he said softly, pointing a chopstick toward a string of encrypted data on my screen. "That endpoint there, the 443 handshake, it's exposed. A clever ghost could spoof that with a man-in-the-middle attack, bypass your biometric wall, and watch you through your own camera without ever tripping an alert." I froze, my breath hitched in my throat as I stared at the line of code. He was right. It was a microscopic vulnerability, something I had planned to patch next week, yet he had spotted it in a second. "You're a beggar who understands polymorphic encryption and network handshakes?" I turned my head, my nose inches from his. Up close, the rugged stubble didn't hide the precision of his features, the high aristocratic bridge of his nose, the hard set of a jaw that looked like it was carved from basalt. "Who are you, really?" "Because the homeless man act is failing the Turing test right now." He didn't flinch. He simply reached out and plucked a piece of kimbap, dipping it into the spicy sauce with a slow, deliberate motion. "I told you, the streets teach you how things break. If you want to survive in the gutter, you learn how the pipes are connected. I've spent a lot of time watching people like you, Tuilika. People who think their digital walls make them untouchable while they leave their back doors unlocked." "You're deflecting," I whispered, though I couldn't deny the thrill of the intellectual challenge. I had spent my whole life being the smartest person in the room, the prodigy daughter who had to prove she belonged in the rooms her adoptive parents moved in. I was used to people being intimidated by my mind. He was dissecting it. "I'm offering a solution," he countered. He leaned back, his silhouette casting a long, imposing shadow against the cafe wall. "Tafari is a mosquito. But the men who poisoned that drink? They're wolves. You're a brilliant woman, but you're playing a game of chess while they're playing a game of war. You need someone who knows the shadows, someone who can stand beside you at those galas as a consultant, someone to handle the physical world while you secure the digital one. I laughed, a sharp, cynical sound. A tech consultant? You want me to put a man I met in the street yesterday on my payroll and introduce him to my board of directors? Why not? He tilted his head, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. I've already saved your life once tonight. I cleaned up well, didn't I? And I clearly know your software better than your lead engineers do. I looked down at my bowl, the steam rising to dampen my face. I thought about my apartment, the high-tech fortress I had built for myself. It was filled with top-tier security and expensive gadgets, yet it often felt like a hollow glass box. I had spent years building walls, a defense mechanism born from the moment I realized my skin and my history made me an other even in my own family. I had never let anyone in because I didn't think anyone could see the real me behind the code and the ambition. But this man, he was looking at me now, and for the first time I didn't feel like a CEO or a target. I felt like a woman being truly seen. I have conditions, I said, my voice regaining its executive steel. You stay where I can see you. You don't touch my private servers without my authorization. And if I find out you're working for the Viper or any other rival firm, I won't just fire you. I'll make sure your digital existence is erased so thoroughly you won't be able to open a refrigerated locker in this city. Ho-chul reached across the table. For a second, I thought he was going to shake my hand. Instead, his fingers brushed against mine as he reached for the shared dish of pickled radishes. The contact was brief, a mere ghost of a touch, but it sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core, a spark that made the air between us feel heavy and charged. I wouldn't expect anything less from a queen, he murmured. His eyes held mine, the intensity in them so fierce I forgot to breathe. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the table. A notification from my home security system flashed red. Unknown device attempting Bluetooth pairing. Front door. My blood ran cold. The gala wasn't the end. They were already at my house. They're fast, Ho-chul said, his gaze shifting to the screen. He stood up in one fluid motion, the beggar completely gone, replaced by a man of action. He reached down, his hand wrapping firmly around mine to pull me up. His palm was warm, solid, and terrifyingly reassuring. Finish your tea, Tuilika. We're going to your place. It's time to see if your digital shield can actually hold against a real siege. As we stepped back out into the rain, I realized I hadn't even asked him what his last name was. But as he shielded me from the downpour with his own coat, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just bringing a consultant home. I was inviting the storm inside. The rain didn't just fall. It sieged the windshield of my sleek, electric SUV as we glided through the neon-soaked arteries of Gangnam. Beside me, Ho-chul was a silent, looming presence. He didn't fidget. He didn't marvel at the leather interior or the silent hum of the motor. Instead, his head moved in slow, rhythmic arcs, scanning the side mirrors and the dark spaces under the overpasses. Every time I shifted gears, my knuckles brushed the fabric of his trousers, a coarse, heavy wool that felt like a jolt of static electricity against my skin. The silence in the car wasn't empty. It was pressurized, thick with the scent of his damp coat and the ozone of the storm. You drive like you're escaping something, he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in the pit of my stomach. I drive like I have somewhere to be, I countered, pulling into the subterranean garage of my building. In this city, if you aren't moving forward, you're being trampled. We ascended 40 floors in a glass elevator that blurred the world into a smear of golden lights. When the doors slid open directly into my foyer, the apartment came alive. Welcome home, Tuilika, the soft, synthesized voice of my OS hummed. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sprawling, wet tapestry of Seoul, but inside, the air was filtered, climate-controlled, and smelled faintly of expensive gin and silicone. It was a minimalist's dream. All white marble, recessed lighting, and floating workstations. It was a fortress of glass, beautiful and entirely lonely. Ho-chul stepped onto the polished floor, but he didn't look at the view. He walked to the perimeter, his fingers trailing lightly over the window frame. He paused at the corner, glancing up at the recessed housing of a 360-degree thermal camera. "Looking for a way out already?" I asked, tossing my keys onto the marble island. I tried for playful, but my voice had a defensive edge. "Looking for the blind spots," he murmured, turning to face me. The shadows of the room caught the hard angles of his face. "You have 3. The ventilation intake, the service hatch in the pantry, and the fact that you trust your sensors more than your instincts." I bristled, walking over to my main rig, a trio of curved monitors that glowed like altars in the dim room. "My sensors don't have bad days, Ho-chul. Watch." I tapped a command, and the center screen bloomed into a complex, pulsing web of data. This was my masterpiece, Aegis 7. It wasn't just a firewall, it was a living, breathing neural network that learned from every probe. I began to walk him through the architecture, my voice gaining speed and heat as I spoke. I showed him the recursive loops, the way the AI mimicked human behavior to frustrate hackers. When I talked code, the world outside, the assassins, the fake dates, the loneliness, faded. I was the architect here. I was the god of this digital machine. "Impressive," he said, stepping closer. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "But what happens when the enemy isn't a machine? What if they—" Suddenly, the ambient blue lights of the apartment bled into a harsh, rhythmic crimson. A low-frequency pulse began to thrum through the speakers. "Alert. Brute force entry detected on Node 4. SQL injection attempt in progress. Origin. Masked." "Speak of the devil," I hissed, my fingers already dancing across the mechanical keyboard. The clicks were like rapid-fire hoofbeats. "They're hitting the investor database. They want the encryption keys." I felt Ho-chul move behind me. He didn't interfere, but he leaned in, his hand resting on the back of my chair. "They're using a distraction," he whispered, his breath ghosting over the nape of my neck. "Look at the traffic on the secondary port. It's too quiet. It's a ghost ping." I narrowed my eyes, my brain shifting into a higher gear. He was right. While the front door was being hammered, someone was trying to slip through a side channel. "Bastards," I muttered. I didn't just block them. I opened a honeypot, a fake directory, labeled private keys, and watched the intruder's signature dive for it. As soon as they bit, I executed a reverse shell. I didn't just want them out, I wanted them broken. "If you want my data, have a virus instead," I whispered. I slammed the enter key, sending a recursive wipe command back up their own connection. On my screen, the intruder's signal flickered and died in a jagged line of red. The lights returned to a soft, warm amber. I exhaled, my heart hammering against my ribs, the adrenaline making my skin prickle. I looked up at Ho-chul, expecting him to be confused. Instead, he was watching me with an intensity that made me feel more exposed than the hack ever could. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, or perhaps a predatory hunger. "You don't just defend," he noted. "You retaliate." "I don't like being touched without permission," I said, the double meaning hanging heavy in the air. The tension was suffocating, vibrating between us like a live wire. To break it, I walked to the kitchen. I need to eat. Adrenaline makes me crave salt. I moved with practiced efficiency, pulling jars of fermented paste and glass containers from the fridge. I started a pot of kimchi jjigae, the kitchen soon filling with the sharp, pungent aroma of aged cabbage, garlic, and the smoky heat of gochugaru. The sizzle of the pork belly in the pot was the only sound for a while. It felt strange, having a man in this kitchen, watching me cook. It felt domestic. "You make it the traditional way," he observed, leaning against the island. "My mother taught me." "Well, my adoptive mother," I said, stirring the bubbling red broth. "She wanted to make sure I never lost the flavor of where I came from, even if I didn't have the memories." I reached back to adjust my apron, and for a second, the hem of my silk blouse lifted. The light caught the small, intricate tattoo at the base of my spine, a series of geometric lines that looked like a stylized crown or a compass. "That mark," Ho-chul said, his voice suddenly sharp, devoid of its earlier playfulness. I froze, then smoothed my shirt down. Just a childhood thing. I'm adopted, remember? It was there when they found me in the orphanage. I don't know what it means. Probably just a brand from a hard life I don't recall. He didn't answer. When I turned around, he was staring at me, his expression unreadable, a mask of stone. But his hand, resting on the marble, was clenched so hard his knuckles were white. We ate in a silence that felt different now, heavier, laden with secrets. I watched the way he handled his spoon, the quiet dignity of his movements. He didn't eat like a man who had spent his life begging for scraps. He ate like a man who was used to being served. I went to the sink to rinse a dish, leaving my phone on the island. It buzzed. A text from Tafari flashed on the screen. "I know where you are, Tui. You think a dirty street rat can protect you? I'm coming to take back what's mine." I didn't see it. I was busy staring out at the rain. But Ho-chul saw. His eyes darkened to a terrifying midnight black. While my back was turned, he reached out, his long fingers grazing the screen with surgical precision. With a few swift taps, the message vanished. The number was purged, and the device was silenced. He did it so smoothly, so invisibly, that when I turned back, he was simply sipping his water, looking as calm as a deep well. He stood up, walking toward me until the space between us was non-existent. The smell of the spicy stew mingled with his scent, creating something intoxicating. He reached out, his hand hovering near my waist, his fingers almost, but not quite, touching the area where my tattoo was hidden. The heat from his palm seeped through my clothes. "You're a very talented woman, Tuilika," he whispered, his voice grazing my ear. "But you have no idea how deep the shadows in this city really go." I looked up at him, my pulse leaping in my throat, my hand resting on his forearm. His muscles were like iron beneath the sleeve. I wanted to pull him closer. I wanted to push him away. Suddenly, the apartment's perimeter alarm chimed, a soft, persistent warning. I glanced at the monitor by the door. "Someone's in the private lobby," I whispered, my blood turning to ice. "And they aren't using the intercom." Ho-chul didn't look at the screen. He looked at the door, and for the first time he reached into the small of his back, his hand gripping something hidden beneath his jacket. "Stay behind me," he commanded, and the beggar I had hired was gone. In his place stood a king preparing for execution. The lobby alarm turned out to be a ghost in the machine, a deliberate low-level ping designed to test my response times, but the silence that followed was far louder. In the 3 nights that followed that initial breach, my apartment stopped being a fortress and started feeling like a pressure cooker. The first night was about the code. We sat side by side at the workstation, the glow of the monitors casting blue and violet hues over Ho-chul's sharp profile. I was deep in the logic gates of Aegis 7, trying to trace the origin of the Gala attack. "There," he said, his hand coming to rest on the back of my ergonomic chair. His fingers were inches from my shoulder, and I could feel the heat radiating from him. The attacker didn't go for the data. They went for the timestamp. They wanted to know when you're most distracted. "I'm never distracted," I retorted, though my heart was currently performing a rhythmic staccato against my ribs, because his scent, rain and something metallic, was drowning out the smell of my black coffee. "Everyone is distracted by something, Tuilika," he murmured. He reached past me to point at a line of code, his forearm brushing mine. The contact was electric, a jolt that traveled straight to my core. I didn't pull away. I found myself leaning into the warmth, my breath hitching as I realized he wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at the pulse jumping in my neck. By the second night, the tension had shifted from digital to physical. He insisted on leveling up my survival chances. "Your software is a shield, but what happens when they're in the room?" he asked, clearing the space in my living room. He stood behind me, guiding my arms into a defensive posture. "If someone grabs you from behind, don't fight their strength. Find the leverage." His hands settled on my waist, firm and steady. My silk lounge pants felt like a thin, useless barrier against his palms. He pulled me back against his chest to demonstrate a release maneuver, and for a heartbeat, I forgot to breathe. His chest was a wall of solid muscle, I could feel the steady, heavy thrum of his heart against my shoulder blades. "Like this?" I asked, my voice coming out breathy and unfamiliar. I turned in his arms, our faces inches apart. His eyes were dark, searching mine with a hunger that made my knees weak. His thumb grazed the side of my ribcage, a touch so lingering it felt like a brand. "Exactly like that," he whispered, his gaze dropping to my lips. He didn't move, he waited, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. I stayed anchored in his space, my pulse racing, until a chime from the server room broke the spell. We sprang apart, both of us breathless, the air between us thick enough to choke on. The third night, the storm outside matched the one brewing in my chest. We were taking a break, sitting on the floor by the floor-to-ceiling windows. I found myself telling him about Tafari, not the polished version I told investors, but the raw truth. "He didn't just want my company," I said, staring at my reflection in the dark glass. "He wanted to own the part of me that makes me me. He used to tell me that without him, I was just a girl with a laptop and a missing history. He made me feel like my adoption was a defect, not a beginning. I came to Seoul to build a world where no one could ever reach me again." Ho-chul was silent for a long time. Then, he reached out, his hand covering mine on the cold floor. "I knew a man once," he said, his voice sounding like it was being pulled from a deep, dark well. "He thought loyalty was a currency he could spend. He was betrayed by the only family he ever knew, the man who raised him into a life of shadows. He learned that the only way to stay alive is to trust no one, to keep your heart in a vault. But vaults are just different kinds of cages, aren't they?" I looked at him, noticing the way he spoke of shadows with such weary familiarity. "You talk like a philosopher, not a man from the streets, Ho-chul." "The streets are the best university in the world," he deflected, but his grip on my hand tightened. The breaking point came an hour later. We were running a siege drill. He was playing the intruder, and I was supposed to use my new evasion moves to reach the panic button while simultaneously locking down the server via voice command. I moved to slip past him, but he intercepted me, his arms locking around my waist. I spun, using the leverage he'd taught me, but he was faster. He pinned me against the cool marble of the kitchen island, his body weight pressing me into the stone. The adrenaline from the attack was screaming through my system, my lungs burning, my skin on fire where he touched me. "Got you," he rasped, his face inches from mine. "Not yet," I whispered, my hands sliding up his chest to bunch in his shirt. The world narrowed down to the point of contact. I didn't think. I acted. I pulled him down, and our mouths crashed together in a collision that was more desperate than delicate. It was a chaotic, starving kiss. The taste of him was dark and addictive, a mix of coffee and something primal. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, needing to bridge the impossible gap between us. He groaned into my mouth, a sound of pure, unadulterated want, his hands sliding down to grip my hips and lift me onto the counter. For a moment, the deception didn't matter. The danger didn't matter. There was only the heat of him and the way he claimed my breath as his own. Then, abruptly, he ripped himself away. He stumbled back, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and fractured with a conflict I couldn't decode. "This can't happen," he breathed, his voice ragged. "Not yet. Tuilika, you don't know. I can't let this." He turned and practically fled toward the guest suite, leaving me shivering on the counter, my lips swollen, and my mind a shattered mess of longing and confusion. I stayed there for a long time, trying to steady my hands. Eventually, I stood up to clear the training area. As I moved his discarded beggar jacket from the sofa, something heavy fell out of the pocket and clattered onto the hardwood. I picked it up. It wasn't a coin or a cheap lighter. It was a Patek Philippe Grand Complications, a watch that cost more than most people's houses. The platinum casing gleamed mockingly under my smart lights. I stared at it, the weight of the metal matching the sinking feeling in my gut. I walked to his door and knocked, not waiting for an answer before I pushed it open. He was standing by the window, his silhouette sharp against the city. I held up the watch, my voice steady despite the chaos in my heart. Street life comes with Swiss timing now, Ho-chul? Or did you just happen to find a $200,000 timepiece in the gutter? He didn't turn around. Some things are hard to leave behind, he said, his voice cold again. The warmth of the kiss completely evaporated. Before I could demand the truth, my phone on the nightstand screamed, a high-pitched, jagged frequency I had programmed for only one thing, a physical breach of the building's main power grid. The lights in the apartment flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging us into a terrifying, velvet blackness. "They're here," Ho-chul said, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice. "And they aren't coming for the software anymore." I looked at the watch in my hand and then at the shadow of the man I had just kissed. I had invited a stranger into my bed and my heart, a man who carried the riches of a king and the secrets of a killer. And as the backup red lights began to swirl, I realized I might have just helped my own executioner through the door. The crimson emergency lights flickered, a dying heartbeat in the hallways, before the apartment plunged into a total, suffocating velvet. Outside, the sky over Seoul didn't just break, it detonated. A crack of thunder ripped through the air, so loud and sudden that the floorboards vibrated beneath my feet. I didn't just jump, I shattered. The sound wasn't just weather, it was the echo of Tafari's fist against the door of our old apartment in London. It was the sound of a glass breaking against a wall while he screamed that I was nothing without his connections. My lungs suddenly felt like they were filled with wet sand. I couldn't draw a full breath. The darkness pressed in, smelling of cold rain and old terrors. I reached out, my fingers clawing for the edge of the marble island, but my knees felt like water. "Tuilika?" Ho-chul's voice was a low anchor in the dark. I felt him move toward me, his presence a shift in the air's weight. I'm fine," I lied, my voice cracking like thin ice. I tried to use my tech brain, my logical center, to calculate the distance to the emergency kit, but my neural pathways were jammed by the static of a panic attack. Inhale for 4, hold for 4. I couldn't even manage 2. Another flash of lightning strode through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the room in a jagged skeletal white. For a split second, I saw his face, not the face of a beggar, but a man of granite and shadow. Then the thunder followed, a guttural roar that made me gasp and cover my ears. "Hey, look at me." His hands were on my shoulders. They weren't clutching or demanding, they were heavy grounding weights. "You're in your fortress. You built this. The storm is outside. It can't get in." He guided me to the sofa, his movements sure even in the pitch black. I heard the scrape of a match, and a moment later, a small amber flame bloomed between us. He lit a cluster of thick, vanilla-scented candles I usually kept for aesthetics. The room softened. The dancing shadows on the ceiling were no longer monsters. They were just light playing hide-and-seek. The silence grew thick, filled only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. I sat there, hugging my knees, my silk blouse damp with cold sweat. I felt pathetic. I was a CEO, a pioneer of security, and I was trembling because of a few decibels of sound. "It's not the storm, is it?" he asked softly, sitting on the floor at my feet, his back against the sofa. He didn't look at me, giving me the dignity of privacy while offering his proximity. "It's the memory of one," I whispered. I found myself reaching for the hem of my shirt. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or the way the candlelight made everything feel like a confession, but I needed to touch something that felt real. I lifted the fabric slightly, exposing the ink on my ribs. I've spent my life securing everything, my servers, my home, my heart, but I don't even know where this came from. I was 4 when I was found. No records, just this. Ho-chul turned his head. As the candlelight hit the geometric lines of the tattoo, I saw a change in him that terrified me. He didn't just look, he recognized. His entire body went rigid. His breath hitched in a way that sounded like a physical blow to the chest. For a long, agonizing minute, he didn't move. Then, with a slow, trembling hand, he reached out. "May I?" I nodded, my heart hammering a new, frantic rhythm. His fingertips brushed the skin of my ribcage. The contact was searing. He traced the outer edge of the crown-like shape with a reverence that felt almost religious. I watched his face. The mask of the beggar had completely disintegrated. His jaw was set, his eyes wide and fractured with a shock so deep it looked like grief. He knew what this was. He knew exactly what was written on my skin. "It's beautiful," he rasped, his voice strained as if he were speaking through a throat full of glass. "And it's heavy. A mark like this. It doesn't just come from nowhere. It carries the weight of a kingdom." "What do you know, Ho-chul?" I demanded, leaning toward him, my hair falling over my shoulder. "Tell me." He pulled his hand back as if burned, but the intensity in his gaze didn't waver. He didn't answer my question. Instead, he stood up and sat beside me on the sofa, pulling me into the crook of his arm. I didn't resist. I collapsed against him, burying my face in the crook of his neck. He smelled of wood smoke and the cold metallic tang of the storm, a scent that felt like home and danger all at once. "I had a family once," he whispered into my hair, his hand stroking my back in slow, hypnotic circles that gradually stilled my shaking. "Not blood. But we were bound by something stronger. Loyalty. Or so I thought. They didn't just leave me. They carved the pieces of my life away until there was nothing left but the shadow you saw on that sidewalk. I learned that trust is a luxury for people who have nothing to lose. For people like us, it's a death sentence." "We aren't the same," I murmured, though my body was betraying my words, melting into his warmth. "I'm a woman of logic. You're a mystery I can't solve." "Logic can't explain why your heart is beating against mine right now," he countered. He shifted, his hand moving from my back to my jaw, tilting my face up. The candlelight caught the gold in my eyes and the midnight depth of his. The air between us became a physical thing, charged, electric, vibrating with the same frequency as the lightning outside. My hands wandered up his chest, feeling the hard, ridged scars beneath his shirt that spoke of a history far more violent than any street brawl. His thumb traced my lower lip, his gaze dropping to my mouth. I wanted him. I wanted to drown out the sound of the rain with the sound of our breathing. I wanted to forget the mystery and just feel the man. As he leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, I felt his pulse thrumming against my fingertips. Fast, wild, and desperate. Our lips brushed, a ghost of a kiss, a promise of fire. A low, pained groan escaped his throat, his grip tightening on my waist, pulling me flush against his heat. I felt the strength in him, the sheer dormant power of a man who could level the city if he chose. But then, he stopped. He didn't just pull back, he wrenched himself away, his hands shaking as he cupped my face one last time. His eyes were tortured, gleaming with a silent vow I couldn't understand. "You deserve the truth before this goes any further," he whispered, his voice ragged with a conflict that seemed to tear him apart. "And I am not free to give it to you. Not yet. If I take what I want right now, Tuilika, I'm no better than the men who hunted you." He stood up, walking to the window, his silhouette a lonely sentinel against the storm. I sat on the sofa, cold and aching, my skin still tingling where he had touched the tattoo. My analytical mind was screaming at me to push him, to demand the watch's origin, to demand the meaning of the mark. My phone, sitting on the coffee table, suddenly chirped, a low battery alert that bypassed the silence mode. A grainy thermal video feed from the building's perimeter, powered by a backup independent of the main grid, flickered onto the screen. 3 shadows were moving through the flooded lobby. They weren't police. They carried suppressed submachine guns, and they were moving toward the express elevators with professional, lethal intent. I looked at the screen, then at the man standing by the window who seemed to know my soul better than I did. "Whatever you're hiding, Ho-chul," I said, my voice gaining a new cold clarity as I grabbed my tablet to initiate the final lockdown protocols. "It's coming for us both tonight, and I don't think they're here for the software." He turned back to me, and for the first time he didn't look like a beggar or a consultant. He looked like a king who had just found his queen in the middle of a battlefield. "Then let them come," he said. "I've been waiting for a reason to burn this city down." The morning after the storm, the apartment smelled of burnt ozone and expensive wax, a lingering ghost of the violence we'd narrowly avoided. We had spent the pre-dawn hours scrubbing the digital and physical traces of the intruders away, but the air remained charged. "We can't hide in this glass box anymore," Ho-chul said, his voice sandpaper rough as he leaned against my kitchen island, nursing a black coffee. "The Viper is testing the perimeter. If we don't step into the light and show them you're untouched, they'll realize they've rattled you. We go to the masquerade tonight." "As a target?" I asked, my fingers flying over a tablet as I rerouted my server traffic. "As a power," he corrected. Preparing for the gala felt like arming for a crusade. I chose a gown that was a defiant declaration of my dual identity. The bodice was a structural masterpiece of vibrant West African Ankara print, gold and indigo geometric patterns that mirrored the circuitry of my mind, while the skirt was a heavy, flowing waterfall of midnight blue Korean silk. As I stood before the mirror, Ho-chul stepped into the frame behind me. The beggar was officially dead. He wore a tuxedo of such exquisite cut it could only have been bespoke. The lapels featured a subtle, tonal embroidery, reminiscent of a traditional hanbok jacket. He looked like a man who had never known the touch of a sidewalk. "The zipper," I murmured, my voice betraying a slight tremor. He stepped closer, his presence filling the reflection. His fingers, calloused but incredibly gentle, grazed the skin of my spine as he gripped the metal tab. I felt my breath hitch as he slowly slid it up, his knuckles dragging over the area where my hidden tattoo sat beneath the fabric. He lingered at the top, his hands resting on my shoulders. Our eyes met in the glass. A smart, scarred woman and a king in a pauper's shroud. "You look like a queen about to claim a throne," he whispered, his thumbs tracing my collarbone. The venue was the grand ballroom of the Shilla, a cathedral of crystal chandeliers and masked deception. The air was a thick fog of bergamot and vintage champagne. As we stepped onto the marble floor, Ho-chul's hand settled on my waist, possessive and heavy. It wasn't just for the cameras. He was shielding me, his body always angled to intercept any threat before it could reach my orbit. "Stay close," he murmured against my ear, his thumb stroking a rhythmic grounding pattern against my hip. "The wolves here wear silk, but they still bite." We hadn't been there 10 minutes before the crowd parted like a dark sea. A man in a shimmering silver mask and a sharp gray suit approached. The Viper. On the surface he was a pillar of the business community, but beneath the mask his smile was as thin as a razor blade. "Miss Theron," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr. He took my hand, his touch cold. "A striking harmony you've achieved tonight. This fusion of cultures, it's as complex as your software. Though, one wonders if such beauty can survive a direct assault." "Beauty is just the interface, Chairman," I replied, my voice steady, my mind already running a diagnostic on his body language. "The core architecture is built for resilience. I don't break easily." The Viper's eyes flickered to Ho-chul, who stood like a silent obsidian statue at my side. "And you're?" "Consultant, a man of many talents, I hear. It's a dangerous jungle, Tuilika. A queen needs a real shield, not just a temporary one. Some protections are quite fleeting. My shields are permanent, and my allies are chosen for their depth, not their surface," I countered. The Viper leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Just be careful of what you carry. Some lineages are better left buried in the dirt. A crown can become a noose very quickly." As he walked away, I felt Ho-chul's grip tighten until it was almost painful. His jaw was a hard line of granite, his eyes burning with a raw, terrifying fury that had nothing to do with the fake date ruse. "He knows," I whispered. "He knows nothing." Ho-chul growled. "He's a scavenger. Let's finish the deal." I moved to a private table in the alcove where the primary investors for my next expansion were waiting. Using the strategic insights Ho-chul had fed me over the last few nights, flaws in the regional logistics and subtle shifts in the market that only someone with deep subterranean knowledge would know, I tore through their objections. I wasn't just selling software, I was selling an empire. I sealed the deal with a flourish, signing the digital contract. I felt a rush of pride, a brilliant spark of my own genius, unaware that the specific offshore accounts I had just integrated into the deal were strings leading back to a legitimate front for the Shadow King standing behind me. When I stood up, flushed with victory, Ho-chul didn't congratulate me. He looked at a younger man in a wolf mask who had been staring at me a second too long, and his jealousy, raw, primitive, and undeniable, boiled over. Without a word, he caught my hand and pulled me onto the dance floor. The orchestra began a dark, sweeping waltz. He didn't lead me, he claimed me. He spun me into his space, his hand splaying across the small of my back, pulling me so flush against his chest that I could feel the frantic, heavy thrum of his heart. Ho-chul, everyone is watching, I breathed, my pulse racing as he dipped me low, his strength the only thing between me and the floor. Let them watch, he rasped, his voice cracking with a torment that made my heart ache. He pulled me back up, his face inches from mine, his breath hot against my lips. You're mine tonight, Tuilika. No one else touches what's mine. No one else looks at you. Do you understand? This wasn't the beggar. This wasn't the consultant. This was a man who was terrified that the world he lived in would swallow the only light he had found in the dark. The dance was a battle, a public claim that silenced the whispers in the room. He looked at me with such desperate, aching hunger that I forgot how to breathe, my fingers digging into the silk of his shoulders. The music swelled and faded. We stood in the center of the floor, the world spinning around us. He didn't let go. He leaned in, his lips grazing the shell of my ear. I would burn this entire room to the ground to keep you safe. He straightened, his eyes regaining their cold, kingly focus. As he led me off the floor, my phone vibrated in my clutch. I pulled it out, my heart dropping. An anonymous message. The queen wears a stolen crown. Ask the beggar about the night of the blue moon. I looked up at Ho-chul, my breath hitching. He was staring at a man in the balcony who had just given him a sharp, military-style nod. That dance, I whispered, my voice trembling as I tucked the phone away. That wasn't just for show, was it? Ho-chul didn't answer. He just tightened his hold on my hand, his eyes promising a war that was already at our gates. The masquerade is over, Tuilika. Now, we survive. The morning after the masquerade began with a deceptive golden peace. The Seoul skyline was scrubbed clean by the previous night's storm, and the apartment was filled with the quiet clink of ceramic and the smell of fresh coffee. Ho-chul was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his tuxedo jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and history. He looked back at me, and for a fleeting moment, the weight in his eyes softened. He reached out, his thumb grazing my jawline as I passed him a mug. You're quiet, he murmured. Just processing, I said, leaning into his touch for a heartbeat too long. The deal, the dance. You. He didn't pull away. He looked like he wanted to say something real, but then his eyes shifted to the workstation. Your system is chirping, Tuilika. Low frequency. I pulled my tablet from the counter, expecting a routine update or a post-Gala news alert. Instead, a wall of red text scrolled past my eyes. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. Aegis 7 hadn't just flagged an external threat, it had logged an internal breach. Wait, I whispered, my fingers trembling as I sat on the stool. I didn't cry. My first instinct was logic. It was the only armor I had. I began to pull the logs. My breath hitched. 3 nights ago, at 3:14 a.m., while I was asleep after our first training session, an administrator-level login had occurred from an IP address routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. I cross-referenced the timestamp. That was the night I'd left him alone in the living room for 20 minutes to shower. I dug deeper, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. There were outgoing packets, thousands of them, my core encryption keys, my private investor list, and I felt the blood drain from my face. High-resolution scans of my adoption records and the photos I'd taken of my tattoo. Tuilika? What is it? Ho-chul moved toward me, his hand reaching for my shoulder. I flinched away as if his touch were a live wire. Don't. I turned the screen toward him. My voice was a cold, brittle thing, a ghost of the woman who had danced in his arms hours ago. Explain this, Ho-chul. Explain why your street smarts include knowing my master override codes. Explain why my software is being funneled to Vanguard Holdings, a company that, according to these logs, paid out a $500,000 consulting fee to a blind account yesterday morning. His face went completely still. It was the mask of the king again, but this time, it felt like a tomb. Tuilika, look at the source code. It's a ghost trace. Someone is framing. The timestamps don't lie. I screamed, the logic finally breaking, the agony flooding in. You were never a beggar. You were a thief who saw a lonely woman with a high-end server and a missing past. Did you enjoy it? The training? The kiss? Did it make the heist easier knowing I was starting to trust you? I have never lied about how I feel about you, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating low. You lied about everything else. I grabbed the Patek Philippe watch from the counter and hurled it at his chest. It hit him with a dull thud before clattering to the marble. Get out. If I ever see you again, if I even see a shadow that looks like yours, I will use every line of code I've ever written to erase your existence from every system on this planet. I will make you a ghost in a world of machines. The silence that followed was deafening. He didn't plead. He didn't move. He just looked at me with an expression of such profound, fractured torment that for 1 second my logic wavered. But then I looked back at the screen, at the evidence of my life being sold off piece by piece, and the steel returned to my spine. Go, I whispered. He picked up his jacket and walked toward the elevator. He didn't look back. As the doors slid shut, the apartment felt suddenly, violently empty. The rain began to hammer against the windows again, a relentless, gray assault that mirrored the wreckage inside me. I collapsed onto the floor, the silk of my gown, the one that had felt like a triumph last night, pooling around me like a bruise. I sobbed until my throat burned, my mind obsessively replaying the way his hand had felt on my waist, cataloging every touch as a lie, every whisper as a weapon. Hours passed. The coffee turned cold. The light faded. I eventually crawled back to the monitors. I wouldn't let them win. If I was going down, I would know exactly who had pulled the trigger. I bypassed the forged logs and went into the deep kernel archives of my own AI, the parts even a master hacker couldn't touch. I began to research the tattoo. I ran the geometric patterns through a clandestine database of international criminal symbology. After 4 hours of processing, a hit flashed on the screen. It wasn't a random mark. It was the crest of the Blue Moon Syndicate, a powerful Korean Mafia faction that had been purged 20 years ago. The symbol was specifically reserved for the Seongju, the star heir. I wasn't just an orphan. I was the hidden daughter of an underboss who had been murdered in a coup. My bio father hadn't abandoned me. He had hidden me in a desperate bid to keep the lineage alive. My breath caught. Ho-chul's reaction to the tattoo, he hadn't just been surprised, he had recognized a ghost. Then, I turned my attention to the breach. I didn't look at Ho-chul's IPs. I looked at the metadata of the packets themselves. I found a string of trash code, a signature I recognized. Tafari. I dug into his encrypted communications, my fingers flying with a cold, lethal heat. I found the link. Tafari hadn't just been stalking me, he had been a puppet. He had sold my location, my habits, and my adoption history to the Viper to settle a $3 million gambling debt. The evidence against Ho-chul hadn't been gathered by a thief. It had been planted by my ex and the Viper, using the very back doors Tafari had helped me build when we were first together in London. Every past hurt, every whispered insult from Tafari, had been a calculated move to weaken me for the Viper's final strike. They had weaponized my trauma to isolate me from the only man who was actually protecting me. I stood up, my legs shaking but my heart turning into a block of ice. I looked at the rain-streaked window, my reflection staring back, not as a victim, but as the star heir. They think they broke me, I whispered into the dark, empty room. I reached for my safe and pulled out a sleek matte black drive and a compact pistol I'd kept for emergencies. They just gave me a target. I began to gear up, the grief of the betrayal being replaced by a rising, incandescent fury. The Viper wanted a war. Tefari wanted my soul. They were about to find out that a queen with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in the shadows. The silence of the apartment was a lie. A thin veil stretched over a pit of vipers. I stood in the center of the living room, the weight of the matte black pistol heavy and alien in my palm, my other hand clutching the drive containing my life's work. My heart was a drum, beating out a rhythm of cold, crystalline fury. Ping. The perimeter alert on my tablet flared crimson. Motion in the private lobby. 4 men. Professional spacing. Tactical silhouettes. "They're coming," I whispered, the words tasting like copper. I didn't run for the panic room. I ran for the console. My fingers flew, arming the final scorched earth protocols I'd written for a day I never thought would come. The power flickered. The hum of the air conditioning died. In the sudden vacuum of sound, I heard it, the heavy, synchronized thud of boots in the hallway. Click. A lockpick attempt. I smiled, a jagged, mirrorless expression. Try again, bastards. They didn't try again. Instead, a muffled thump signaled a shaped charge. Boom. The front door didn't just open, it disintegrated. The blast wave threw me back against the marble island, ears ringing, the air suddenly thick with pulverized drywall and the acrid sting of C4. Through the rolling smoke, 3 shadows emerged, goggles gleaming green. "Now," I hissed. "System, Protocol Medusa," I commanded. From the ceiling vents, 2 hidden automated turrets, non-lethal but high velocity, dropped and began a rhythmic thwip thwip thwip, peppering the lead attackers with rubberized kinetic rounds. At the same time, I triggered the floor grid. Blue sparks danced across the hallway's metallic trim. One thug screamed as the current buckled his knees. Strobe. Go. High-intensity lights hidden in the molding began to pulse at a dizzying frequency, designed to induce vertigo. The attackers staggered, their tactical vision hindered by the chaos. I dove from behind the island, leveled my pistol with both hands, and squeezed the trigger. The kickback jolted my shoulder. The second thug went down, clutching a thigh. I was a code warrior, a queen of logic, and every trap was a line of execution. One left. He was fast. He dove through the strobe, rolling behind my sofa. Master key. "Now, Theron." He barked, his voice distorted by a modulator. I didn't answer. I reached under the island for the gas bypass. Vent gas, kitchen. A hiss of pressurized CO2 flooded the area, creating a white out. I moved toward the bedroom, but a 4th shadow, one I hadn't seen, burst from the service hatch in the pantry. A taser lead hissed through the air. Snap crackle. The agony was absolute. It wasn't pain, it was the erasure of my nervous system. I hit the floor, my muscles locked in a horrific vibrating spasm. The drive clattered away. Before I could blink, a heavy boot pressed into my ribs, and cold zip ties bit into my wrists, ratcheting bone deep. "Smart girl," the thug sneered, dragging me up by my hair. "But a shield only works if you don't let someone behind it." He shoved me toward the elevator. I struggled, my vision swimming. "You're dead. My AI. It's already broadcasting your biometrics to every precinct in Seoul." "Not if we burn the server first," he countered, raising a suppressed rifle to my temple. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. But it wasn't reinforcements for the Viper. It was a nightmare in a tailored suit. Ho-chul stepped out, his tuxedo shirt shredded and soaked in a deep, terrifying crimson at the shoulder. He didn't look like a beggar or a consultant. He looked like the god of the underworld. He didn't say a word. He roared, a primal guttural sound of pure, unadulterated carnage, and launched himself. He was a blur of violence. He caught the first thug's rifle mid-swing, snapping the man's wrist with a sickening pop. He spun, a combat knife appearing in his hand like a magic trick, carving a path through the smoke. He took a bullet to the side. I saw the fabric of his shirt bloom red, but he didn't even flinch. He was a machine built for one purpose, to reach me. Ho-chul. I screamed. The man holding me raised his gun. Move and she dies. Ho-chul froze, 5 feet away. He was heaving, blood dripping from his fingertips, his eyes fixed on mine with a ferocity that made my breath stall. I don't think so, I whispered. I tapped my chin against the smart collar of my blouse, a prototype sensor. Override, comms burst. The thug's earpiece suddenly emitted a 140 decibel screech of white noise. He shrieked, clutching his ear, his aim wavering. It was the only opening Ho-chul needed. He closed the gap in a single stride, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and sending him flying through my glass coffee table. Ho-chul turned to me, his hands shaking as he pulled a blade to cut my ties. The moment I was free, I grabbed my pistol and leveled it at the last man rising from the floor. Click, clack. He froze. Building lockdown level 10, I commanded. Steel shutters slammed over the windows and the elevator bank, sealing us in the ruined apartment. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hiss of the fire sprinklers and Ho-chul's ragged breathing. He collapsed against the island, sliding down until he sat on the floor, his face ashen. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands hovering over his wounds. The smell of gunpowder and copper was overwhelming. "You're a fool," I choked out, half furious, half sobbing. "I told you to leave. I told you I'd erase you." "You couldn't," he rasped, a weak bloody smirk touching his lips. He leaned his head back, his eyes fluttering. "I never stole from you, Tuilika. I was protecting you, because that mark on your skin makes you more dangerous to them than any code you'll ever write." "What are you talking about?" I pressed a hand to his shoulder, trying to staunch the flow. "The blue moon." "Your father," he coughed, a spray of red hitting the marble. "He was my ally, my mentor. They killed him to take the throne, and they've been looking for his ghost ever since. You are that ghost. You are the heir to everything they stole." My heart stopped. The logic, the data, the betrayal, it all shifted, falling into a new, terrifying pattern. He wasn't the thief. He was the guardian of a kingdom I didn't know I owned. "You're a Mafia king," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "I'm a man who's dying in your kitchen," he countered, his hand reaching up to cup my cheek, leaving a smear of red on my skin. "And more are coming. The Viper. He won't stop until the moon is extinguished." Outside, the distant wail of sirens began to rise, cutting through the Seoul night. Were they cops? Or were they more of his men? Or mine? I looked at him, bloody, broken, and yet still looking at me like I was the only thing that mattered in a burning world. I gripped his hand, my fingers interlacing with his. "If you're lying to me again, Ho-chul," I said, my voice hardening into a blade of pure steel, "I'll finish what they started. I'll be the one to kill the king." He smiled, a beautiful, tragic thing. "Then help me live long enough to prove I'm not." I pulled his arm over my shoulder, hauling his dead weight up. We staggered toward the hidden service stairs, leaving the wreckage of my fortress behind. The war wasn't just in the shadows anymore. It was on my doorstep. And this time, I wasn't just defending my company. I was going to take back my crown. The industrial warehouse on the edge of the Han River smelled of wet rust, stagnant oil, and the approaching end of a long, bloody night. We moved through the shadows, Ho-chul's weight leaning heavily against me, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle that terrified me more than the men waiting in the dark. A single spotlight cut through the gloom, illuminating a throne-like chair in the center of the vast, hollow space. The Viper sat there, his silver mask discarded on a nearby oil drum. He looked older without it, haggard, yet radiating a poisonous satisfaction. In his hand, he held my matte black drive, tossing it upward and catching it with a lazy flick of his wrist. The digital shield and the Shadow King, the Viper's voice echoed, bouncing off the corrugated steel walls. I expected a grand entrance, not a desperate crawl. "It's over," I called out, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I kept my phone gripped tight, my thumb hovering over the execute command for my final protocol. "Over?" The Viper laughed, a dry, rasping sound. He stood up, walking toward us until he stood at the edge of the light. My dear Tuilika, it hasn't even begun. You look at that mark on your skin and see a mystery. I look at it and see the man I had to butcher 20 years ago to take what was mine. Time didn't just slow, it curdled. My heart gave a singular, deafening thud against my ribs. Butcher? Your father, Seong Min, was a man of high ideals and low survival instincts. The Viper continued, his eyes gleaming with a cruel fire. He was the underboss of the Blue Moon, the beloved Star King. He wanted to take the Syndicate legitimate. He wanted a world where his little star Heir wouldn't have to hide. So, I orchestrated a coup. I watched the life leave his eyes while he begged me to spare you. He hid you in that orphanage like a dirty secret, hoping the ghost of his lineage would never be found. But the ghost walked into my trap tonight wearing a pretty dress and carrying the keys to my kingdom. I felt the world tilt. My father, not a man who abandoned me, but a king who died to shield me. The weight of 20 years of loneliness crashed down, replaced by a cold, incandescent rage. I looked at Ho-chul. He didn't look surprised, he looked devastated, his eyes fixed on me with a silent, bleeding apology. "Kill them," the Viper said, his voice dropping to a casual whisper. "And bring me the girl's head. I'm tired of being haunted." 6 men stepped from the shadows, suppressed submachine guns raised. "Now." I screamed. I tapped the screen. Aegis 7 didn't just defend, it colonized. I had hacked the warehouse's internal grid the moment we crossed the perimeter. The overhead industrial strobes began to fire in a jagged, blinding sequence, turning the warehouse into a fractured nightmare of light and shadow. I triggered the feedback loop in the attackers' comms. A high-frequency screech tore through their earpieces, making them howl and claw at their helmets. "Left," I yelled. Ho-chul moved like a ghost made of blades. Despite his wounds, he was a whirlwind of brutal efficiency. He caught the first man's throat, a knife flashing in the strobe light. Slash. Thud. I wasn't just watching, I was directing. I swiped my screen, and a massive overhead crane, its magnetic lock bypassed, swung with a groaning roar, sweeping 2 more thugs into a stack of shipping crates with a sickening crunch. I killed the lights. He killed the man in the dark. It was a symphony of chaos, the smell of gunpowder, the metallic tang of blood, and the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of my keyboard as I manipulated the environment like a god. We were winning. We were a storm of tech and teeth. Then, a singular, dry crack echoed through the space. The Viper stood by the oil drum, a snub-nosed revolver in his hand, the muzzle smoking. Ho-chul jerked. He didn't scream. He just stopped. A bloom of dark, wet red exploded across the center of his chest. He turned to me, his eyes wide and fading, before he collapsed onto the oil-slicked concrete. "No." The scream tore from my throat, raw and jagged. I dove to his side, sliding on the grit. The Viper stepped into the light, his face twisted in a triumphal sneer. "The king dies. The heir watches. This is how legacies truly end, Tuilika. In the dirt." He raised the gun toward my forehead. I didn't look at the barrel. I looked at my phone. My fingers were already moving. "You talk too much," I whispered. I didn't lunge for the gun. I lunged for his power. Protocol supernova. Broadcast. The Viper's brow furrowed. Suddenly, his own phone, and the phones of every man in the room, began to scream. Across the city, on every news jumbotron in Myeongdong, on every dark web forum, and on the private screens of every police commissioner in Seoul, the video played. I had recorded the entire monologue, his confession, the coup, the murders. The financial trails I had unearthed in Phase 7 were now a viral wildfire that no one could extinguish. "What have you done?" He hissed, his hand shaking. "I exposed the truth," I said, my voice as cold as the concrete. "You aren't a boss anymore. You're a headline." In the distance, the wail of 100 sirens rose like a choir. The men in the shadows hesitated, looking at their screens, seeing their boss's empire crumble in real time. The Viper lunged, a desperate final snarl on his lips. But a hand, bloody, trembling, but iron strong, reached up from the floor. Ho-chul, using the last of his strength, grabbed the viper's ankle and yanked. The old man went down hard. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the floor and brought it down on his wrist. The gun clattered away. I didn't kill him. I wanted him to watch the police take him. I wanted him to live through the disgrace. I collapsed back over Ho-chul, my hands frantically searching for the trauma kit I'd seen on the schematics. I found it, ripping it open with my teeth. My phone guided me, my AI identifying the wound and projecting a holographic overlay on his chest to show me where to apply pressure. I hacked the JVAC, forcing a blast of sub-zero air into our sector to slow his heart rate, to keep the blood inside him just a few minutes longer. "Stay with me," I sobbed, pressing the hemostatic gauze into the wound. "You hear me, Ho-chul? That's an order from your queen." He blinked, a faint, beautiful spark of life returning to his eyes. He reached up, his bloody fingers fluttering against my cheek. "Your father would be so proud." "I don't care about him right now," I whispered, leaning my forehead against his as the blue and red lights of the police finally flooded the warehouse. "I care about you." The viper was dragged away in chains, screaming about his empire. But I didn't look back. I watched the paramedics swarm us, my AI still pulsing on my screen, a silent guardian of the man I loved. The warehouse was cold, and the night was long, but as the sun began to peek over the Han River, I knew the truth. The star heir wasn't hidden in an orphanage anymore. She wasn't a victim of a fake date or a puppet of a rival boss. She was burning bright, and no one would ever put her out again. The morning sun filtered through the penthouse windows, warming the intricate patterns of the handcrafted Hanji paper screens that now accented my minimalist marble furniture. 6 months ago, this place was a sterile fortress. Today it smells of roasted coffee, gochujang, and the faint, woodsy cologne of the man currently standing at my stove. The server logs are clean, but the Hong Kong liaison is pushing his luck, Ho-chul said, not looking up as he deftly flipped a pancake. He wore a simple black t-shirt that stretched over the scars on his chest, scars he'd earned for me. "Let him push," I murmured, leaning against the island as I swiped through a data stream on my tablet. "I've already rerouted his offshore holdings into a dead-end server. He'll find his bank accounts as empty as his threats by noon." Ho-chul turned, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. He walked over, his hands, large, steady, and calloused, settling on my waist. He pulled me flush against him, the heat of his body a constant grounding comfort. "I almost feel sorry for the man," he whispered against my throat. Almost. An hour later, that ruthlessness was required. We sat in the living room across from a new syndicate lieutenant who had the audacity to smirk at my tablet. "The tech girl thinks she can run with the wolves of the Blue Moon?" He sneered, looking to Ho-chul for a laugh that didn't come. "Perhaps you should leave the strategy to the men who know how to bleed for this city." I didn't blink. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply tapped a key. "Lieutenant Park," I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. "You've been skimming 7% from the Busan docks through a shell company registered to your mistress's brother. You think you're a wolf? You're a stray dog eating scraps from my table. By my calculations, you owe the syndicate $3 million. If you speak again, I'll leak the coordinates of your private vault to the tax authorities." The man turned a shade of gray I'd never seen before. He opened his mouth, saw the pride and cold death in Ho-chul's eyes, and promptly excused himself with a trembling bow. When the door clicked shut, Ho-chul let out a low, rough chuckle. "You're terrifying, Tuilika. It's incredibly distracting." Later that evening, as the Seoul skyline glittered like a fallen galaxy below my balcony, I led him out into the crisp air. The candles flickered, casting a golden glow over us. I reached into my robe and pulled out a small velvet box. "I'm tired of consultants and alliances," I said, looking him dead in the eye. I opened the box to reveal a heavy platinum band, a deep blue star sapphire set into the metal, surrounded by microscopic engraved circuitry. "I want to merge our empires fully. Not as a subordinate, but as your equal." Your queen. I took his hand, sliding the ring onto his finger. I hired a beggar once. Now I rule with a king, and I want the world to know it. Ho-chul's breath caught, his eyes shining with a raw, fierce emotion as he pulled me into his arms. The kiss was deep, claiming, and tasted of a victory we had bought with blood and brilliance. I leaned my head back, whispering against his lips as the city roared below us. I hired a beggar to be my fake Valentine. Now I rule with a real king, and no one will ever question who wears the crown.
Wow, what a great story. Bravo.